I didn't know you did this to me.
I hired a male escort to pretend to be my boyfriend at my cousin's wedding to my ex. A simple, elegant solution. Perfectly planned to shut my family up and show them I was fine, or at least better than they expected. But when I arrived at the club to meet him, the man who showed up wasn't the one I had chosen. I should have left right then, should have questioned it, been suspicious, called the whole thing off. But I didn't, because there was something about him, in his gaze, in the way he carried himself, in the quiet certainty he exuded, that made me agree before I even thought it through. And it was only later that I understood the truth that changed everything. I wasn't the only one who made a deal that night. Hi, I'm Lena, and this story is just beginning. Chapter 1. The Man Who Wasn't Who I Expected. There was a contract folded inside my pocket, and I pretended it was a perfectly rational choice. Letterhead, discreet signature, agreed upon amount in 2 installments, the first already transferred. All very clean, very professional, very different from what anyone in my family would ever expect from me, and that was exactly what I wanted. The club had an entrance lit by a row of amber lights, and music leaked through the glass door as if sound also needed air. I adjusted my dress belt, took a deep breath, and walked in with the kind of posture my mother used to call Queen's Head, Heart of Stone. Except my heart wasn't made of stone. It had just learned not to show. It had been a week since I received the cream-colored invitation with the initials G and C intertwined in gold. Ginevra Ferrante and Connor Reed. Her name I expected. His name made me sit on the hallway floor for a good 2 minutes before I got up and went to get a glass of wine that didn't solve anything, but at least kept my hands busy. Connor Reed had been mine for 18 months, and had been hers long enough to appear on a wedding invitation. It didn't hurt the way it should have hurt, and that discovery itself was more revealing than anything he could have told me. What hurt was something else, something older and deeper, that had my Uncle Augusto's face and my cousin's sharp smiles every time I walked into a room, and silence fell like a verdict. I was the outside niece, the daughter of the sister who married wrong, who left the clan, who walked away, and I had grown up carrying that label like it was a second skin that never fit right. This time I wasn't going to show up apologizing for my existence. This time I was going to show up devastating, and I was bringing company. That's why the contract in my pocket. I scanned the room looking for the man the agency had described. Dark-haired, tall, gray suit, name Felipe. There was a bar in the back, some low tables with candles, and a row of stools where a man in a dark suit sat with his back to the entrance. That was him. It had to be. But before I got more than 3 steps closer, the man stood up from the stool and turned around, and the entire room seemed to lose half a shade of light, because suddenly there was only that man in my field of vision, and everything else became scenery. He was tall in the way that takes up space before even moving, in a dark suit, almost black, and his eyes were already on mine, as if he knew exactly where I was going to appear from. I stopped in the middle of the room. It wasn't a decision. The man in the dark suit walked toward me, and when he reached me, he tilted his head slightly and said, in a low voice that didn't need volume to fill the entire space, "Serena." It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation. "Matteo Romano, I'm your date for the weekend. The agency sent an email," Matteo said, before I could ask about Felipe, with the tone of someone closing a subject before it starts. There was a last-minute switch. I was notified in his place. He said it with such calm and such naturalness that, for a second, I almost hated the fact that it made sense. My phone had been on silent since morning, buried in my purse along with my dignity and the rest of the plan, and I hadn't checked anything. I could have stopped there and demanded explanations, could have walked away, but I didn't want to fix this. I just wanted, for once, for something to work out without me having to fight for every detail. He wasn't what I expected, but there was a wedding. There was an uncle who looked at me like I was the clan's erratum. There was a radiant cousin about to marry the man who had slept in my bed for 18 months, and I didn't have the time or energy to reorganize the plan. "Do you know what you're hired to do?" I asked, with the firmest voice I could muster. Matteo Romano looked at me with that absolute calm and answered, "Accompany you to your cousin's wedding, and make sure no one has anything to complain about, and that the entire family understands I'm fine." "That too," he said, and there was something there that wasn't exactly humor, but was in the vicinity. I grabbed my purse with more firmness than necessary and said, "Then let's go." The car was dark and silent, and smelled like leather with something I couldn't identify, but that was engraved in my memory with irritating insistence. Matteo drove with one hand on the wheel, and the other resting on the armrest, relaxed in the way only men accustomed to control can be, not because nothing affects them, but because they've learned to let tension exist without letting it show. I looked out the window and pretended there was no tension. The road to the Ferrante estate took a little over an hour, and in the first 20 minutes I spent the time rationalizing. It was a service. There was a contract, and the fact that the man driving wasn't exactly what I had ordered didn't change, in theory, the function of the agreement. I repeated this like someone organizing boxes on a shelf to avoid having to look at what's broken on the floor. Service rendered. Wedding endured. Family silenced. It wasn't simple, but it needed to seem that way. My phone buzzed. It was Isla, my best friend, and the only person in the world with the unique talent of panicking by proxy. Did you pick him up yet? What's he like? Send a pic. Send it now. I glanced at Mateo sideways. He had his eyes on the road and an expression that revealed nothing. There was a change, I typed. It's not the same man. 3 dots blinked for what seemed unnecessarily long for the response that came. What do you mean it's not the same man, Serena? I put away my phone before she made me laugh at the wrong time. Large family? Mateo asked, without taking his eyes off the road and without any preamble. The question caught me off guard, and it took me a second before I answered, the kind that compensates quantity with intensity. The corner of his mouth moved. It didn't even become a smile, but it was the first time anything on his face had changed since we met. And the groom? He asked, with the same casual tone, as if he were asking about the weather. He's the ex-boyfriend. I let that land in the air without elaboration. Mateo didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I understand. You don't need to understand, I replied. You just need to look like you adore me. He turned his eyes to me for a second, just one, before returning to the road. That's not going to be a problem, he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made my stomach do a thing I decided to ignore. I looked at Mateo Romano, who drove with that disconcerting serenity, with his profile outlined against the lights of the road, and thought that, regardless of what had gone wrong with the original plan, the family was already in collapse before we even arrived, and that was worth every penny of both installments. What I didn't know yet, what would take me too long to understand, was that he had found me with his eyes before I walked into that club, that the name Serena Ferrante wasn't new to him, that the last-minute change hadn't been an accident at all, and that the man beside me in that car knew exactly who I was, whose niece I was, and what he intended to do with that information. I looked out the window at the distant lights of the estate, and felt only the weight of the contract in my pocket, and the silent heat of someone sitting too close, who breathed too slowly, and who I had just let into my life. Chapter 2. Welcome to the estate, Serena. The Ferrante estate was the kind of property that doesn't need to explain itself. The iron gate opened slowly, as if it knew the arrival needed time to be observed, and the jacaranda-lined driveway led the eye straight to the main house. White, wide, with verandas that repeated across 2 floors, and lit windows that looked like watchful eyes. There were horses in the pasture on the left, and a garden on the right that someone had spent years making look casual. I'd known all of this since I was 12, and had never stopped feeling that low stab in my stomach upon arrival, that feeling that the place was too beautiful for someone who had never been treated like she belonged to it. Mateo's car stopped in front of the main entrance, and before I finished breathing deeply enough to get out, he was already at my side, and opened the door with a smooth, unceremonious movement, as if it were just what you do, without needing commentary or applause. I took the hand he extended and stepped out, and that's when I saw the first figures on the veranda. Aunt Rosanna stood with a glass of Prosecco frozen mid-air, her eyes going from me to Mateo, and back to me with the speed of someone doing calculations she doesn't want anyone to notice. Beside her, Aunt Bettina held Cousin Lara's shoulder with the firmness of someone needing structural support to stay standing, and Lara had her lips parted in the kind of expression that, under other circumstances, I would have photographed. None of them said anything. For about 6 seconds, none of them said absolutely anything, and those 6 seconds were worth every mile of the road. Mateo stood beside me and placed his hand on the small of my back with light, firm pressure, the kind that doesn't ask permission, but also doesn't announce anything. It just exists, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and I felt the heat of that gesture pass through the fabric of my dress and settle in the wrong place in my reasoning. Serena, the voice came from inside the house before I took a step forward, and I recognized the tone before I even saw the face. Ginevra Ferrante appeared at the door in a cream silk dress, and the smile she wore when she was winning, wide, bright, and with all her teeth showing. She hugged me with the efficiency of someone fulfilling protocol, and then stepped back, her eyes rising to Mateo with a curiosity she didn't bother to disguise. "And you brought company," she said, turning to me with the tone of someone making one observation while making another. "I did," I replied, with the same warmth one uses to confirm a hotel reservation. Mateo extended his hand to Ginevra and said his own name once, with his usual economy of words, and there was something in the way he did it, without smiling too much, without leaning in, without doing anything that signaled he was impressed with the place or with the bride, that made her smile lose 0.5 millimeter of width. She wasn't used to men who didn't react to her smile. It was a small detail, but I registered it with the kind of satisfaction one keeps in silence. The welcome dinner happened on the covered back veranda, with the long table the Ferrantes reserved for occasions that needed to seem intimate, but were, in practice, an arena. There were flowers in the center, lit candles, and the kind of lighting that makes everyone slightly more beautiful, and slightly more dangerous at the same time. I was spent the first 15 minutes trying to extract information with the delicacy of someone using a pickaxe where a teaspoon would fit. "But where did you two meet?" she asked me, with the tone of someone who already has a theory and just wants confirmation. "At work," I replied, before she finished setting her glass down on the table. Aunt Rosanna waited for more. I didn't give more. She turned her eyes to Matteo with the smile of someone going to try from the flank, and he met her gaze with a cordiality so precise and so absolutely closed that she returned to her plate without having gotten anything, and I had to hide my face behind my water glass to keep from letting anything slip. On the other side of the table, Connor Reed sat next to Ginevra, with the expression of someone who had rehearsed being happy, and was at that moment forgetting his lines. He was handsome in the way that photographs well, the kind of beauty that works in context, but, up close, stops impressing. And I looked at him with the clinical curiosity of someone analyzing an old scar to see if it still hurts. And the answer was, no, it didn't hurt. There wasn't much more than a dull strangeness in the place where something used to be. What there was his gaze, which sometimes crossed the table and came to me, and which he either didn't know how to disguise or didn't care to. The heat near my ear was the first thing I felt. Then Matteo's voice, low enough not to carry past my chair. He doesn't look like a very focused groom. I didn't answer. I looked forward, at the breadbasket in the center of the table, and felt the heat rise up my neck, with a determination I absolutely did not authorize, and I hoped the candlelight was good enough to hide what was happening to my skin. Matteo returned to his previous position without comment, as if he had said something about the weather, and I continued looking at the breadbasket for about 3 seconds longer than necessary. Augusto Ferrante arrived at dinner after everyone else was already seated, which was exactly the kind of thing he did, appear when attention was already distributed, so that redistribution would be inevitable and total. He was a man who used presence as a tool, and the tool was sharp as always. I watched him make his way around the table with the usual greetings, the kiss on Ginevra's forehead, the handshake with the men, and then his eyes reached me and stopped on Matteo. It was 2 seconds, maybe less. My uncle's expression didn't change the way it changes when someone is surprised, but it changed in the more subtle, more controlled way, which is the change of someone who recognizes something he didn't expect to find and decides in real time what to do with that information. Augusto's eyes returned to me with the protocol smile intact, and he said, "Serena," with the exact affection of someone who knows affection is expected. "Uncle Augusto," I replied, with the same level of precision. He greeted Matteo with a brief handshake and an introduction I didn't hear properly because I was watching Matteo's face, and Matteo's face revealed absolutely nothing, which I was already learning was information in itself. Dinner continued. Conversations overlapped, wine circulated. Ginevra told the story of the proposal for the 3rd time since I'd arrived, and the aunts made the appropriate sounds at the appropriate moments. But at some point between the appetizer and the main course, Augusto stood up with the excuse of getting another bottle of wine and crossed the space behind the chairs toward the wine cellar, and I wouldn't have noticed anything if not for the fact that Matteo followed that movement with his eyes for a fraction of a second. So quick I almost thought I'd imagined it. I got up to go to the bathroom a few minutes later, and passing through the interior hallway, heard the voices before I saw the two of them. Augusto was leaning against the door frame of the wine cellar, with a tone that intended to be casual and wasn't, saying something about business in the region and partnership opportunities, and Matteo stood facing him with his hands in his pockets, and the posture of someone who hears everything and concedes nothing, not a sign of interest, not a gesture of openness, not even the head tilt people do out of courtesy when they want to end a conversation with elegance. He stood still, looking at my uncle, and the silence between them was the kind that has weight and temperature. Augusto smiled, said something I didn't hear, and returned to the table. Matteo stood still for a second after he left, and then turned his eyes toward the hallway, and found me there, standing in the middle of the path, having seen everything. Neither of us said anything. He just looked at me with that absolute and impermeable calm, and I felt I was facing something that still had no name and that, in some way I couldn't explain at that moment, was bigger than a weekend contract. I looked away and returned to the table, and I spent the rest of dinner feeling Matteo Romano's eyes on the side of my face, without once being able to decide whether I wanted him to stop. Chapter 3. She shouldn't like this so much. The room they assigned us had a queen bed, 2 windows overlooking the garden, and a sofa that had clearly been placed there for decoration and not for anyone to sleep on. I walked in first, set my suitcase on the chest at the foot of the bed, and stood looking at the mattress for a second before saying, with the most practical tone I could muster, "You take the bed. I'll sleep on the sofa." Mateo walked in behind me, assessed the room with a single glance, and replied, "No." I turned to him. "No, the bed is yours," he said, as if that settled the matter, and went to the closet to check the space with the same expression of someone reviewing a work contract. I wanted to argue. I had 3 good arguments lined up. But there was something in the way he said it, without negotiation, without excessive chivalry, just as a fact, that made the arguments seem smaller than they were, and I ended up sitting on the edge of the bed in silence with the slight and irritating feeling of having lost a debate before it started. On the other side of the screen, Isla was having the opposite experience. "He gave you the bed? Serena, that's not escort behavior. That's main character behavior." "Isla," I typed. "He's hired. It's part of the service." "Honey," she replied. "Service doesn't sleep on the sofa. Service asks for a separate room." I closed my phone before she convinced me of something I wasn't ready to consider yet. The days at the estate had a structure that the Ferranti family applied with the seriousness of internal regulations. Collective breakfast at 8, morning activity, lunch together, free afternoon with veiled supervision, and mandatory dinner. Everything designed to create the illusion of spontaneity within a very well-rehearsed choreography. Mateo navigated all of it with an ease I didn't expect, and that bothered me in a way that took me time to name. He knew when to speak and when to stay silent. He knew how to answer the aunt's questions with enough cordiality not to seem rude, and not enough to feed more curiosity. He knew how to stand next to me without needing to touch me for everyone in the room to know we were together. On the morning of the second day, the family organized a horseback ride through the property, in pairs, because the Ferrantis didn't know how to do anything without turning it into competition disguised as affection. I rode alongside Mateo on the trail that crossed the orange grove, and he stayed silent for a long time before pointing to a spot beyond the trees and saying, "There's a broken fence there, the third post from the left." I looked in the direction he indicated. There really was. "You know farms? I know properties," he replied, with that economy that sometimes seemed like an answer, and sometimes seemed like a half-open window. "That's different from knowing farms?" He turned his face to me with the corner of his mouth slightly raised, not a full smile, but the possibility of one, and said, "A little." I carried that in my head for the entire rest of the trail, and didn't reach any useful conclusion. Isla's phone never rested. "Okay, but do you guys talk? Like for real?" "Sometimes," I replied. And what?" "Serena, you know what I'm asking." I knew. And that was exactly why I had put my phone in the nightstand drawer and stared at the ceiling for about 10 minutes before admitting, in silence, and without typing anything to anyone, that something was happening that wasn't in the contract. It was still small. It was the way he paid attention when I spoke. Not the performative attention of someone being paid to seem interested, but the quiet attention of someone filing away information, registering details. It was the fact that on the first morning, he had ordered coffee without sugar for both of us, and I had never mentioned how I took mine. It was the gesture in the hallway when Aunt Bettina had passed by with a tray, and he had put his hand on my arm to move me out of the way. 2 seconds, fingers on my elbow, contact that ended before it began, and that still stayed there burning softly for too long. I was in trouble. And I knew it with the irritating clarity of someone trying to reason about something that doesn't respond to reason. Connor showed up on the afternoon of the third day. I was on the back veranda with a book I'd read the same page of 4 times when he came out through the side door with 2 glasses of lemonade, and the smile I'd found irresistible 18 months ago, and that now just seemed familiar to me, like a song you've heard too many times to still feel. "Can I sit?" he asked, already pulling the chair. "You're already sitting," I replied, without taking my eyes off the book. He set one of the glasses near my hand and stayed silent for a moment, and then said, with the tone of someone who practiced, "You look good." "Thanks. That wasn't a compliment. It was an observation." He paused. "You seem different." "I am different." I turned the page, which I hadn't read. Connor leaned slightly forward, elbows on his knees, and lowered his voice. "Who is he, Serena?" "My boyfriend," I said, with the same naturalness one uses to give the time. He went quiet. Then, "You didn't tell me you were with someone. You didn't ask." I closed the book calmly, and finally looked at him, and there was something very liberating about discovering that face no longer caused me anything but very calm fatigue. "And even if you had asked, Connor, you're getting married tomorrow. What exactly would you do with that information?" He didn't answer. He stood looking at the garden with the expression of someone who doesn't like the answer he just got from himself, and I picked up the book again and returned to the page I couldn't read, and we stayed like that until he stood up and left without another word. I only realized Mateo was leaning against the door frame behind me when I heard the sound of Connor's footsteps walking away and turned my head. He was there, arms crossed and expression closed, in the kind that doesn't need words to communicate that he saw everything and didn't like part of what he saw. He didn't say anything about it. He just walked in, sat in the chair where Connor had been, and stayed silent for a moment before saying, "Lemonade?" I looked at the glass Connor had left. "You can throw it away." The corner of Mateo's mouth moved. "Thought you'd say that." The night of the third day was hot, and the bedroom windows were open, and I was lying down looking at the ceiling while Mateo read on the sofa with the corner lamp on, and the silence between us was the kind that has texture, not uncomfortable, but present, aware of itself. "Do you always do this?" I asked the ceiling. He took a second. "Depends on what this is. Stay quiet, like you don't need to fill the space." I heard the sound of the book being closed. "Most people talk so they don't have to think," he said. "I prefer the opposite." I turned my head to look at him. He was lying on the sofa with one arm folded under his head, looking at the ceiling too, and there was something about that image, about that huge, controlled man lying on a sofa clearly too small for him, who had chosen that without complaining, that made something tighten in the middle of my chest, in a way I decided not to examine. "You don't have to stay on the sofa," I said, before deciding if I was going to say it. He turned his face to me. His gaze stayed on mine for a second too long to be neutral, and too short to be a declaration, and then he answered, "I know," and turned his eyes back to the ceiling, and didn't move. I kept looking at him for longer than was wise, and then returned to my ceiling, and the night stayed hot, and the silence stayed textured, and neither of us said anything more. The almost kiss happened the following afternoon, and it was entirely the second-floor veranda's fault. The family had organized an afternoon of games in the garden, and I had gone upstairs to get a sweater I wasn't going to wear, just to have 5 minutes away from Aunt Rosanna and the questions she kept asking with different vocabulary. Mateo had gone up after me, without me asking, without explanation, and when I turned in the hallway he was closer than I expected, and the hallway was narrow, and the light coming through the window at the end was that late afternoon light that doesn't favor good decisions. He didn't step back. Neither did I. We stayed like that for a moment I can't measure. The distance between us was the distance of a choice, and his eyes were on mine with that quiet and total attention he had, and that undid me from the inside with an efficiency I was starting to find personally offensive. And then the aunt's footsteps echoed up the stairs with the punctuality of a natural disaster. I stepped back. He stayed where he was for one more second, as if deciding whether he was going to care about the interruption, and then moved away with that calm that resolved absolutely nothing. I went downstairs with the sweater I wasn't going to wear, and stood looking at the game in the garden without seeing anything. Aunt Rosanna said something about teams. Ginevra laughed at something Connor said. The sun was setting behind the trees with a beauty completely indifferent to the state I was in. That night, lying in the dark with the only sound being Mateo's breathing on the sofa, I looked at the ceiling and had the honesty to admit, at least to myself, that I had spent the last 3 hours wishing the aunts hadn't come upstairs. And on the other side of the room, Mateo Romano stayed awake until almost dawn, but I didn't know that yet. Chapter 4. One day before the wedding and she was already lost. The day before the wedding had the kind of tension that the Fiancé family wrapped in tissue paper and called excitement. The flowers had arrived in the morning, the catering was being set up in the side garden, and the aunts circulated through the house with the energy of people who need to be in 10 places at once, and will manage because they simply don't accept otherwise. I had hidden myself in the library. It wasn't an elegant hiding spot. It was a narrow room with old shelves, a window overlooking the garden, and an armchair that smelled of mildew with dignity, but it was the only place in the house where no one had looked for me in the last 2 days, and I needed 15 minutes without someone asking me if I was really okay, with that tone that means the opposite of what it says. The door opened without a knock. Connor Reed walked in with his shoulders slightly hunched, the kind of posture of someone who practiced humility in the mirror before leaving his room, and closed the door behind him with a care that irritated me before he said anything. "I needed to see you alone," he said. "I needed silence," I replied, without taking my eyes off the garden. "One of us is going to leave frustrated." He crossed the room and stood near the window, next to me, with that calculated proximity of someone who wants you to feel the weight of his presence. "Serena," his voice was low, with that inflection he used when he wanted to seem sincere. "I made a mistake. I waited. I made a mistake with you, with everything. And I know I don't have the right to say this now, on the eve of my wedding, but if I don't say it, I'm going to get married," I said, turning to him. "You're going to get married, tomorrow, to my cousin. And that, Connor, was already decided before you walked into this room." He looked at me with slightly widened eyes, the expression of someone who didn't expect to find that calm in the place where he expected to find hurt. "I still love you," he said. And there was a conviction there that, at another time, in another version of me, would have done something, but I stayed absolutely still inside, like someone testing an old wound with a finger and discovering it really healed. And what I felt wasn't pain, wasn't anger, wasn't anything dramatic enough for the moment. It was just a cold and strange clarity, the kind that appears when you finally stop fighting against a truth you already knew. "You don't love me," I said, with the same temperature one uses to correct wrong information in a report. "You're scared of getting married, and I'm familiar enough to seem like an exit. That's different. He opened his mouth, closed it. Leave, Connor. I turned back to the window. And tomorrow, show up at the altar on time. I heard his footsteps walking away and the door closing, and I stood looking at the garden for a time I didn't clock, with the strange and slightly disorienting feeling that the last thing tying me to the past had just packed its bags and left without making noise. What remained in its place wasn't emptiness. It was something else. Warmer, more nameless, with the face of a man in a dark suit who slept on the sofa without complaining, and who had stayed awake all night without me knowing. The formal dinner the night before had tall candles, plates no one touched with enthusiasm, and conversations that existed to fill the space between one silence and another. I showed up in the dark wine dress I'd brought for an occasion exactly like this. The kind of dress that doesn't scream anything, but that makes everyone look twice without knowing why. And when Matteo saw me come down the stairs, the only movement he made was to stop talking to Raphael, the discreet man who had appeared at the estate that afternoon, without anyone explaining very well who he was, and become completely still for a second. I registered that second with an attention I pretended not to have. At the table, Matteo stayed by my side as always, and dinner continued with the usual choreography. Aunt Rosanna trying to make conversation, Augusto at the head with eyes that calculated everything, Ginevra radiant with the energy of someone who tomorrow is the center of the universe and wants everyone to know. Connor was on the other side of the table. And Connor was looking at me the way he had learned not to when we were together, and had forgotten to stop doing now that we weren't. Matteo noticed. I knew he had noticed because he had gone still for a different second, not the second from before, on the stairs, which was admiration, but a more closed, denser second, the kind that precedes decisions. And then he leaned toward me. The movement was slow enough for me to feel his heat before contact, the shoulder close, the arm slightly brushing mine, and his mouth near my ear with a proximity that made my reasoning lose a step and not recover. "Look at me," he said, very low, just for me. I turned my face to him, and there was no distance. There wasn't the reasonable distance that exists between people who have a contract between them. There was only his face very close to mine, with dark eyes, and an expression that wasn't cold, but wasn't easy to read, and the noise of the entire dinner seeming to happen on another frequency. He put his hand on my face, slowly, with his fingers touching my chin with a lightness that was his version of a question, and then he kissed me. It wasn't a shy kiss. It wasn't the kind of thing you do to fulfill protocol or sustain a narrative. It was slow and deliberate, and hot, in a way that went through everything I had for armor, and reached straight to a place I didn't even know was unprotected. I heard the conversation at the table die in a cascade, silence arriving from one side and then the other, and I didn't care, because there was a hand on my face, and a mouth against mine, and a heat in my chest that wasn't authorized to exist, but existed with absolute conviction. When he pulled away, it was with the same calm with which he had approached. And I stood looking at him for a second without being able to assemble a complete expression, and then I turned my eyes to the table and realized Connor had left. No one was looking at the door he went through. Everyone was looking at us. The ants had stopped breathing like an organized group. Augusto had his eyes on Matteo with an expression I couldn't decipher, but that was stored somewhere in memory as something to be reviewed later. And Ginevra had her toothy smile that this time had lost more than 0.5 millimeter. Matteo picked up his wine glass with a tranquility I found personally outrageous and took a sip as if nothing had happened. I went upstairs before the end of dinner. I didn't say anything to him. I didn't need to, or maybe I needed to too much, and that was exactly why I didn't. I went to the room, closed the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and stood looking at my hands for a time that served no purpose, trying to put in order a thing that had no order to give. He had kissed me to make Connor disappear. It was calculated. It was part of the role. It was exactly the kind of thing a hired escort would do in a situation like this. It was what I should think. The problem was that my entire body knew that kiss hadn't been just a performance, and I wasn't ready to argue with myself about it. And it had been the most disordered kiss I'd received in years, and that was a problem of proportions I wasn't equipped to handle that night. The knock on the door came 20 minutes later. 3 knocks, spaced out, without urgency. I opened it. Matteo was in the hallway with his jacket removed and the first button of his shirt open, and there was something slightly different about him like this. Not smaller, not more accessible, but one layer less between the man and the world. We looked at each other for a second that had temperature and weight, and then I stepped away from the door, and he walked in, and I closed the door behind him, and when I turned around he was too close for this to still be about the charger. "The kiss wasn't in the contract," I said with the most controlled voice I could manage, which wasn't very controlled. "It wasn't," he agreed, "so you shouldn't have done it." Probably not. He didn't step back 1 millimeter while saying that, and I didn't move forward, but there was a strange force between us that wasn't quite attraction and wasn't quite conflict. It was both at the same time, compressed in a space too small for both to fit without touching. "You kissed me in front of everyone," I said, and there was an accusation there, but also something else I didn't want to name. Yes, his voice was low. To make an impact, he tilted his head slightly, and the movement brought his face closer to mine by a fraction I felt more than saw. Serena. The name in his voice had a different weight than usual, as if he were using it by choice and not by protocol. The impact was for them. The rest was mine. I opened my mouth to respond. I had an answer. It was there. It was a good answer. And then he kissed me, opened his mouth over mine with a slow, deep hunger. The kiss unfolded like a hot wave, tongues meeting in an intimate rhythm, exploring, savoring. His hand slid along my waist, slowly rising beneath my blouse, warming my skin. I sighed against his lips, my entire body responding to his touch. He pressed me against the wall carefully, his firm body pressed against mine. I felt his burning desire against me while my hands opened the buttons of his shirt, revealing the heat of his chest. My fingers descended down his defined abdomen, reaching the waistband of his pants. He sighed softly when I wrapped around him, feeling him pulse strong in my palm. With deliberate movements, he raised my skirt and touched me where I burned most. His fingers entered slowly, curving with precision, while his thumb drew slow and perfect circles. I trembled, breathless, gripping his shoulders. Then he lifted me, my legs wrapped around him naturally. With a fluid and deep movement, he filled me completely, stretching me deliciously. Our bodies moved together in a measured, intense rhythm, each thrust taking us deeper. Pleasure grew like an inevitable tide. When the climax came, it was devastating. I came undone around him in long and powerful waves, calling his name against his neck. He followed me shortly after, releasing himself inside me with hot and intense spasms, his entire body trembling against mine. The lamp remained lit for a long time, illuminating our intertwined and sweaty bodies. Only afterward did the night envelop us, hot and silent, while the estate slept outside. Chapter 5. Wedding, Morning After, and Everything That Changed. I woke up with the sun already high, and the right side of the bed empty and cold enough for me to know he'd gotten up a while ago. I stood looking at the ceiling for about 2 minutes, with the kind of strange calm that appears after something big happens, and the body hasn't decided how to react yet. There was no regret. I had checked. I had run my fingers along the edge of that feeling carefully, looking for something that hurt. There was nothing. There was only a slightly disorienting lightness, and the smell of his cologne on the pillow next to me, which I decided not to mention to anyone, much less to Isla. Mateo was on the veranda with coffee in hand, his back to the door, looking at the garden where staff were adjusting the last chairs for the ceremony. He heard my footsteps and turned his face, not his whole body, just his face, and looked at me for a second with an expression more open and quieter at the same time, before turning his eyes back to the garden. "Coffee's on the table," he said. I sat next to him and we stayed in silence, and the silence was different from all the others we'd had. There was no tension in it, no negotiation. It was just two people in a garden early in the morning, and there was something about that simplicity that seemed to me, for reasons I wasn't ready to articulate, more intimate than everything that had happened the night before. The ceremony happened at noon, under an arch of white flowers that someone had spent hours building. Ginevra appeared in the makeshift aisle in an undeniably beautiful lace dress, and with a smile that was undeniably real, and I watched her walk, and felt only the cleanness of someone who escaped something that wasn't theirs. Connor was at the altar with the posture of someone doing the right thing without total clarity about what that means, and when Ginevra reached him and he took her hands, he looked at the ground for a second before looking at her, just 1 second. But I saw it, and Mateo, who was beside me with his arm slightly touching mine, also saw it, and said nothing, which was the most correct answer possible. When the priest pronounced them married, and the guests applauded, Mateo leaned slightly toward me and said, very low, "There, you survived." I turned my face to him with slightly narrowed eyes. "I was never at risk." "I know," he said, with that calm that was sometimes agreement and sometimes something else entirely. "It was about them surviving you." I looked at him for a second and found no answer, and then the music started and people stood up around us and the moment passed, but it was stored somewhere with the care you have for fragile things. We left before the end of the party. There was no need to arrange it. At some point we looked at each other with the kind of understanding that requires no words, and 15 minutes later, we were in the car on the road back, with the music low and the Fiancé estate disappearing in the rearview mirror. The week that followed was the strangest and quietest I'd had in a long time. We stayed in the city. He had an apartment with high ceilings, little furniture, and books distributed in places that weren't shelves, with the logic of someone who reads in several places and doesn't worry about appearance. It was a place that said things about him without meaning to, and I walked through it with the silent attention of someone learning a new language. We cooked together once. He knew how to cook with the irritating competence of someone who does things well without making a fuss, and I cut the onion wrong and he corrected it without comment, repositioning my hand with his fingers over mine, in a gesture that lasted 3 seconds, and that made me mess up the next cut in a completely different way. You did that on purpose, I said. I corrected your technique, he replied, with an absolutely neutral voice. With your hand. It's the most efficient way. I looked at him. He was looking at the cutting board with an expression that revealed nothing, and that I had already learned to translate as controlled amusement, and I turned to the stove before letting slip anything he could use. There was an agreement between us, said out loud, confirmed by both with the seriousness of people who believed what they were saying at that moment, only while the contract lasts. No attachment, no complications, no expectations beyond the agreed term. It was reasonable. It was adult. It was exactly the kind of arrangement two intelligent people could maintain without damage. I revisited that reasoning with increasing frequency throughout that week, which in itself was already information I preferred not to examine. After I left his apartment, the intercom buzzed. Matteo answered, and heard the doorman's voice say there were 2 men in the lobby with a message from Mr. Ferrante. It wasn't a social visit. The doorman's tone was the tone of someone who realized that before pressing the button, and didn't know what to do with the realization. Send them up, Matteo said. The 2 men were the type who don't need to say what they are because the way they enter a room already says it for them. They stood near the door, side by side, with the posture of people trained to occupy space without seeming threatening, which was, in itself, the most efficient way to threaten. The older one spoke. The message was short, and had clearly been rehearsed to sound casual. Mr. Augusto Ferrante wished to settle the pending matter between the 2 of them before Christmas. There was a proposal, a reasonable financial compensation for the inconvenience of recent years, and a single condition, that Matteo Romano distance himself from the niece, and guarantee that the distance would be permanent. Matteo was silent for a moment after the man finished. He stood in the center of the apartment, hands in his pockets, and an expression that gave nothing away, and the silence he sustained was the kind that makes less experienced people start filling it with unnecessary words. The older man wasn't inexperienced. He waited. Tell Mr. Ferrante, Matteo said finally, with a low and absolutely flat voice, that I heard the message. The man waited for more. More didn't come. That's it? He asked, with a slightly raised eyebrow. For now, Matteo replied. The 2 men looked at each other with the brevity of people who didn't want to be seen doing it, and left without another word. The door closed with a dry click, and the apartment returned to the silence it had before. But it was a different silence now, more loaded, with edges. Matteo went to the window and stood looking at the city lights for a time that had nothing contemplative about it. He was thinking, and thinking for him was always a process that happened inside, and didn't appear on the surface except as a slightly denser quiet than normal. Augusto had used Serena as currency. He had put her name in a negotiation as if she were a variable in the calculation and not a person, and had done it with the naturalness of someone who does that for so long, who had treated that niece as a movable piece for years enough to not even notice he was doing it anymore. Matteo knew that story. He had researched Serena before the club, had read enough about the Ferrante clan dynamics to understand where she fit, or where she didn't fit, which was more accurate. The outside niece. The daughter of the sister who made a mistake. The name that appeared on family lists, but never in decisions. What he hadn't researched, and what no background check could have anticipated, was what it was like to be in the same room as her. The way she held the ground even when the ground was being pulled out from under her feet. The humor she used as armor, and that was, paradoxically, one of the most honest things about her. The clarity with which she had dismissed Connor on that veranda, without drama, without residue, like someone finally closing a window that was open to the wrong weather. He had walked into that club with a plan that made sense in all its parts, and at some point between the jacaranda-lined driveway and a cutting board in a Tuesday kitchen, the plan had continued making sense, but had stopped being the most important thing. His phone buzzed. It was Raphael, his consigliere, who had been monitoring the movement of Augusto's men since they left the car downstairs. 2 men, left without incident. Ferrante is escalating. Matteo typed back, I know. Tomorrow we'll handle it. Chapter 6. She was playing too, but it wasn't a game. Anymore. Augusto's call came on Christmas Eve morning, and his tone wasn't the tone of the protocol calls he made once a year to fulfill his obligation as a present uncle. It was a different tone, lower, more level, the kind he uses when he's managing a situation and wants you to think you're just having a conversation. He said he needed to see me, that there was something important I needed to know before that night's party, that it was about the man I was with. I went to meet him at a cafe near the main avenue, because I preferred neutral territory to showing up at the estate, and I arrived before him just to have time to sit, order a coffee I wasn't going to drink, and arrange my face into an expression that wouldn't give anything away before I knew what he had to say. Augusto arrived in his gray overcoat, with the punctuality he cultivated as a virtue, sat across the table from me, and didn't waste time with small talk. "The man you're with," he said, like someone naming a problem that should have already been solved, "isn't who you think he is." I waited. Matteo Romano. He let the name land on the table between us, as if its weight were enough. "Do you know what that name represents?" "You're going to tell me," I said, and he told me, with the precision of someone who had prepared this in advance. The organization, the reach, the businesses operating in layers, the reputation that didn't appear anywhere in writing, but that everyone in a certain circle knew. He used the words danger and involvement, and you don't know what you're getting into with the frequency of someone who believes repetition is argument, and I heard it all with the coffee cooling in front of me, and my heart making a low and constant noise that was the physical version of the ground shifting, because what Augusto was describing wasn't incompatible with the man I knew. It was, in fact, the only version of him that made sense with all the details I had filed away and couldn't fit together. The calm that wasn't trained, it was structural. The way my uncle had changed expression at that first dinner. Raphael, who appeared and disappeared without explanation. The men who had come on Christmas Eve and that I had only found out about later. Everything reorganized inside me in a second, with the kind of clarity that hurts exactly because it's clear. But there was something else too. The memory of the room at the estate, of the week in the apartment, of the wrongly cut onion, and the hand over mine, of the smile I had seen once, and that I had kept as if it were scarce. And that part didn't reorganize. It stayed exactly where it was, resisting the new frame, with a stubbornness I hadn't authorized. Augusto finished, and looked at me with the eyes of someone expecting impact. I let a second of silence pass, just one, and then said, with the coldest voice I had available, "I know." He blinked. "What?" "That I knew everything." I held his gaze without blinking. From the beginning, Augusto's face went through something he controlled too quickly for me to identify precisely, but that had the shape of surprise. "You're telling me you knew who he was when—" "I'm saying," I interrupted, with the calm of someone who's in no hurry, "that you came here to tell me something that was already my business." He was silent for a moment, evaluating me with eyes that calculated everything, and I held his gaze with the smoothest surface I had in me, which inside was much less smooth than it appeared. Then he changed. It was subtle, a breath, a readjustment in his shoulders, but I had grown up observing this man from afar, and knew when he was switching strategies. "Very well," he said, with a tone that intended to be admiration, and was something else. "Then you're smarter than I calculated." A pause, "which means you'll understand what I'm going to offer." I waited again, because waiting was at that moment the only form of power I had, and I intended to use it. "Command of Romano and Associates," Augusto said. "The company the clan acquired last year. Complete management, profit sharing, more autonomy than my daughters will ever have within the group." He tilted his head slightly. "Everything you always knew you deserved, and that I never gave you, Serena." The honesty of that last sentence was the kind that appears when someone decides the truth is more efficient than courtesy, and it landed with a different weight from everything else he had said, because it was true. It was true with 30 years of history behind it, and with all the times I had walked into a room of Ferranti's and left without anyone noticing I had arrived. "The price," I said, because there was a price. There was always a price with him. "You distance yourself from Romano, permanently." I stood looking at him for a long moment, and then asked, with a direct voice without ornament, "Why do you want this so badly?" He opened his mouth. "I already explained. Romano is dangerous and you—" "No." I put the coffee back on the table. "This isn't niece protection. You don't call me once a year except at Christmas, and now you meet me at a cafe to protect me." I tilted my head slightly, mirroring his earlier gesture. "What does he have that's yours?" The silence was the most revealing answer he could have given, and it lasted long enough for me to know I had hit the mark without him confirming anything. "You're asking questions that don't lead you anywhere," Augusto said, with cordiality completely gone from his voice now. "Or I'm asking the only ones that matter." I stood up, grabbed my purse, and looked at him one last time with the clarity of someone who just understood something big. "I'll think about your offer." I left without waiting for an answer, and without looking back, and the cold street received me with the kind of air that clears your head if you let it. I went to Matteo's apartment, with my heart at a rhythm that wasn't fear, but was in fear's family, and knocked on the door with 3 knocks that had more force than I had planned. He opened it, and read something on my face before I said anything, because that's what he did, and stepped aside to let me in without asking anything yet. "My uncle just told me who you are," I said, facing him in the middle of the apartment, without sitting, without taking off my coat. "I want to hear your version." Matteo stood looking at me for a second with that calm that this time didn't seem like coldness, but rather the way he prepared himself to say a difficult thing without letting its difficulty change what needed to be said. And then he told me. He told me about Augusto, the contracts canceled in cascade, the pressured suppliers, the documents that had redirected entire investments and left 2 years of work without structure. He told it with the flat voice of someone narrating a fact and not needing adjectives because the facts are sufficient, and I heard every word with that attention that hurts because it understands everything. And then He got to the club. "I knew who you were before you walked in," he said, with his eyes on mine and without stepping back. "The escort was dismissed before you arrived. I took his place because you were the most direct way to get to Augusto without him knowing." The silence that followed had edges. I got up from the sofa where I had sat without noticing and went to the window, because I needed distance between my face and his while I reorganized everything again. The introduction at the club, the hand on my back arriving at the estate, every gesture I had kept carefully and that now had a new and colder label underneath. "You used me," I said to the window glass. "That was the plan," he replied, with the same brutal honesty as before, without trying to soften it with context or intention. I stayed silent for a moment. That was long enough for him not to fill, because he had learned when not to fill. And then I grabbed my purse from the sofa and headed toward the door, and I stopped. I stopped with my hand on the doorknob and my coat still closed, and the apartment silent behind me, and I stood there with the anger that was real and justified, and had every right to exist, and with something else underneath it, older and heavier, that had Augusto Ferrante's face, and 30 years of being discarded with a polite smile that was almost worse than indifference. That man had called me that morning to use me as currency for the second time in my life. He had offered me what he had always denied me, as if it were generosity and not debt, and he had sat on the other side of the table, expecting me to be grateful enough to obey. I turned to Matteo slowly. He was exactly where I had left him, standing in the center of the apartment, looking at me with that quiet attention that asked for nothing and promised nothing, and that was, paradoxically, the most honest thing between us at that moment. "The safe in the estate office," I said. "Ginevra accidentally let the password slip years ago. It's the daughter's birthdays." I paused. "And I know what Augusto keeps in there, or at least I know he keeps something he doesn't want anyone to see." I met his eyes. "You want what's yours back. I want him to pay for what he did to me my whole life." I released the doorknob. "So let's make a plan." Matteo stood looking at me for a second, and for the first time since I'd known him, there was something on his face that I could only describe as real astonishment, brief and completely involuntary. And then the corner of his mouth moved with that movement I already knew how to translate. "Okay," he said, "but you need to tell me everything he said this morning." I dropped my purse on the sofa and sat back down, and the cold Christmas Eve apartment got a little warmer, and for the first time in this whole story, both sides of the table were the same side. Chapter 7. The Safe, the Password, and the Christmas that Became an Operation. I arrived at the Ferrante's Christmas party in the red dress my mother had given me years ago, and that I had never worn, because it seemed too expensive for an occasion that never seemed enough. That night I put it on with the deliberation of someone choosing armor. Matteo looked me up and down with that second that had already disoriented me more times than I'd like to admit, and then said, with a very low voice, "You're ready." It wasn't a question. "I am," I replied, and it was true in a way that hadn't been true for much in my life until then. He offered his arm and I took it, and we walked together into the Ferrante house for the 12th Christmas of my life, but it was the first where I knew exactly what I was going to do before leaving. The party had the usual architecture of the family's Christmases: tree in the entrance hall, background music, tables with food no one really touched because everyone was too busy observing each other. The aunts circulated in groups of 2 with glasses of sparkling wine and eyes on everything. Ginevra had arrived earlier with Connor, newlyweds, still in the phase where people smile for photos with conviction. Augusto was in the main room, as always, at the center of a group of older men who listened to him with the attention of people trained for it. He saw me enter and greeted me with the protocol kiss on the forehead, his eyes going to Matteo for a fraction of a second before returning to me with the smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Serena, so glad you came." "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, with the same warmth, and went to get a glass of sparkling wine I wasn't going to drink. Outside, Rafael Conte was parked on a parallel street with 2 men and a phone open to the property map. Matteo had explained the plan to me the night before, with the precision of someone who had mounted operations before and knew that details are the difference between what works and what doesn't. Rafael covered the side exit. One of the men stayed in the office's exterior hallway. The other stayed with the car running. I went in, opened the safe, and left with what was inside. Simple as that, and simple as that was the version he had presented to me so I wouldn't be so nervous, which I knew, and he knew I knew. I stayed at the party for 40 minutes. I talked with Aunt Rosanna about the menu, listened to Ginevra talk about the honeymoon with the attention of someone present in body and elsewhere in mind, and watched Augusto move through the room with that slow step of someone who doesn't need to hurry because he believes everything is under control. Matteo stayed by my side for the first 20 minutes, and then went toward Augusto's group, with the naturalness of someone just circulating, and I understood he was creating the distraction. While my uncle needed to monitor Matteo Romano in a room, his eyes would be occupied. I slipped through the interior hallway as if going to the bathroom. Augusto's office was at the end of the East Wing hallway, with a dark wooden door that had always been closed during the Christmases of my childhood. The room no one entered without being invited, the place I had associated since childhood, with conversations that stopped when I appeared in the hallway. I opened the door with a firm hand, entered, closed it behind me without making noise. The office smelled of paper and varnished wood, and the cigar scent that Augusto smoked once a week with the self-discipline of a man who controls his own vices with the same precision he controls everything else. There was a wide desk in the center, shelves on 3 walls, and the safe built into the wall behind the painting I had noticed at 14, on an afternoon when I had walked in without knocking to return a book, and found Augusto standing exactly there, with an expression I hadn't known how to read at that time. Now I knew. I took the painting off the hook carefully and leaned it against the wall. The safe was gray, small, with a numeric keypad on the lower part. I stood looking at it for a second, and then remembered Ginevra's voice years ago, at some random lunch where the subject had come up in passing. My father is a creature of habit. Did you know he uses his daughter's birthdays as the password for everything? I think it's absurd. And had laughed, and I had filed that away with the automatic attention of someone who doesn't yet know they'll need it. I typed Ginevra's birth date. Nothing. I breathed. I typed Lara's birth date. The safe opened with a dry click that seemed very loud in the office's silence. Inside was a thick envelope, a thin folder with financial documentation, and a small black flash drive. I stood still for a second, too short to be prudent, and too long to be necessary, looking at it with the feeling that I was finally touching the center of a story that had begun long before me. Then I grabbed everything at once, shoved it in my purse, and closed the safe with fingers that obeyed through discipline, not calm. That's when I heard footsteps in the hallway. They weren't the footsteps of a guest who passed by the wrong place. They were footsteps that knew where they were going. I didn't have time to put the painting back. Augusto entered his own office with the expression of someone confirming a suspicion he'd carried all evening. He didn't go to the drawer immediately. First he closed the door, then looked at the painting out of place, and at my purse. Only then did he open the desk drawer and take out a small black gun, with the familiarity of someone who didn't keep it there out of last-minute paranoia, but because he had already considered the possibility of needing it before that night even began. Serena, his voice was completely calm, and that calm was more frightening than any raised tone would have been. Uncle Augusto. I kept my voice at the same register. You don't know what you're doing, he said, with that tone of someone giving me a chance he won't repeat. I know very well, I replied, and my voice was steady in a way I was going to thank myself for later, because inside there was a noise that was fear and adrenaline mixed in a proportion I hadn't experienced before. You're protecting a man who used you. He took a step in my direction, and then stopped, as if measuring the distance. Who entered your life with a plan, and who will dismiss you when the plan is over? Or, I said, without moving, I'm protecting myself, which is something I should have done a long time ago. Starting with you. Augusto's expression changed. Not much, but enough. There was a surprise there he hadn't planned for that night, and for a second I saw beneath Uncle Ferrante and the clan patriarch, and the man with the gun in his hand, the face of someone who underestimated the outside niece one time too many, and was arriving late to this conclusion. He raised the gun, and time did that strange thing they say it does in moments like this. It didn't stop, but it got slower, denser, with every detail arriving in high definition. The light from the desk lamp, the smell of cigar, the sound of the party at the end of the hallway as if coming from another world, and me, facing my uncle, with my purse closed against my chest, and 3 decades of being treated like the lesser version of something others possessed by right, compressed into a single second that tasted like arrival. The door opened. Matteo Romano walked in with the quiet of someone who never needed to announce his presence, and behind him were 2 men I didn't know by name, but who were the type that don't need introductions. Rafael Conte was in the hallway with his phone in hand, and an expression that was the adult version of, I told you it would work. Augusto didn't move for a second. He stood with the gun raised looking at Matteo with the eyes of someone recalculating in real time and not liking what the numbers show. Matteo crossed the room with slow steps and stopped between me and my uncle with the posture of someone who put his own body there as a declaration and not as a reflex. He didn't look at the gun. He looked at Augusto, only at Augusto, with that absolute calm that was, I had understood over the last few weeks, the most complete form of power that existed. Not the power of someone who shouts, but the power of someone who doesn't need to. You know who I am, Matteo said, with a low and final voice, and you know what what's in her purse means for you to leave this room the wrong way. Augusto stayed motionless. Lower the gun, Augusto. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a threat with a deadline. It was just the declaration of how things were going to happen, stated with the certainty of someone who already knows the ending before finishing the sentence. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the gun lowered. Matteo didn't move, didn't relax his shoulders, didn't make any gesture signaling relief. Because there was no relief, there was only the confirmation of something he already knew. He turned his face to me for a second, and in that second there was a question that didn't need words, and I answered with a small nod that meant I'm okay, and he turned his eyes back to Augusto with the expression of someone who has a lot to resolve and is going to start now. I leaned against the shelf behind me and took a deep breath for the first time in several minutes, with my purse closed against my chest and my heart at a rhythm that would take time to normalize, and I looked at my uncle on the other side of the room, smaller than he had always seemed, older, more exposed, and felt not triumph, not anger, but the kind of silent closure that comes when something that stayed open for a long time finally closes. In that room, that Christmas, Matteo Romano was in charge, and Augusto Ferrante had understood that too late to make a difference. Chapter 8. Tearing Up the Contract. Augusto Ferrante was restrained by Matteo's men with the silent efficiency of people who had done this before and didn't need drama to do it well. No shouting, no furniture knocked over, no scene that could leak through the hallway to the party that continued happening on the other side of the house with the cheerful indifference of those who knew nothing. My uncle sat in his own leather chair with his wrists secured and the expression of someone still calculating. Even so, even at that moment, because it was the only way he knew how to exist in a room. Matteo stood on the other side of the desk and let silence work for a considerable time before speaking. The agreement that followed was stated with the precision of a contract, and it was, in fact, a contract, with conditions and consequences, and no room for negotiation. The documents inside the purse I held were enough to destroy Augusto's reputation in more than one setting and more than one country, and Matteo had enumerated this with the calm of someone presenting a report, not a threat. What had been taken in the last 3 years would be returned. Compensations would be transferred on the agreed timelines. And Augusto Ferrante would spend the rest of his life never again uttering the name Romano in any context other than that of a man who had lost a dispute with consequences and would lose a good portion of his assets. My uncle stayed silent for a long moment after Matteo finished. Then he looked at me, not at Matteo, at me, with an expression I had never seen on him before, and that took me a second to identify because I had never expected to find it on that face. It was the expression of someone who finally sees someone he had decided not to see. I said nothing to him. There was nothing I needed to say that the last 15 minutes hadn't said better, and with more permanence. I held the purse with the documents against my chest, kept my gaze on his long enough for him to know I had held it, and then looked away because I was done with that and didn't need anything more from that room. Raphael came in to finalize the details, and I left through the hallway with steps firmer than my knees, which had decided to tremble slightly now that the danger had passed, could produce. Matteo found me outside the office a few minutes later, in the narrow hallway with the single window overlooking the dark garden, where the party continued with its lights and music, completely oblivious to what had happened 20 meters away. We stood in silence for a moment, side by side at the window, and then I held out the purse with the documents inside and said, "Here's what was yours." He took the purse, but didn't open it. He stood looking at it for a second, and then raised his eyes to me with an expression that had layers I was still learning to read, and took from his jacket's inner pocket a paper folded in 4 that I recognized before he even opened it. It was the contract between him and me, the original, on letterhead, with my signature on the last line. Matteo had bought the agency 2 days after our first meeting, not the whole thing, just enough so that every document concerning me reached his hands first. I still didn't know if this irritated me more than it should, or less than would be healthy. He extended it to me without saying anything. I looked at the paper, at my handwriting on the last line, at the date, at the amount that had seemed reasonable on a night when I needed company for a family war, and that now seemed to belong to another person, in a life that had stayed on the other side of many things. I took the contract, and tore it up. The sound of the paper was more satisfying than I had expected. Clean, definitive, the kind that doesn't admit mending. I let the pieces fall into the palm of my hand, and then deposited them in one of the halves, and then saw Matteo take his own copy from his pocket. He had kept both, which I registered as information to examine later, and tear it too, with that economy of movement he had in everything. We stood with the pieces in our hands, and neither of us said anything for a moment that was longer than the usual silence between us. Fuller, more aware of its own weight, and then I laughed. It wasn't planned. It was the kind of laugh that appears when tension leaves all at once, and the body doesn't know what to do with the space that remains. Part relief and part absurdity, because there was something objectively ridiculous about us standing there in a ranch hallway at Christmas with torn paper in our hands after everything that had happened in those weeks. Matteo looked at me, and laughed too. It was the first time. I had seen the corner of his mouth, had seen the dry and controlled humor, had seen the rare smile he kept carefully, but I had never seen this, the real laugh, which came with without warning and stayed longer than he probably planned, and that changed his face in a way I had no words to describe, but that I stood watching with the attention of someone who knows they're seeing something that doesn't appear often. And there, in that hallway, I understood with the inconvenient and inevitable clarity of true things that I was completely lost, and that I had been lost for longer than I had admitted to myself, and that the part of me that had tried to keep this within the limits of a contract had been naive in a way I was going to forgive, because it had been naive with the best of intentions. Mateo stopped laughing before me, but his face stayed different, more open, with that one less layer I had seen only once before, in the apartment, when he had looked at my shoes forgotten on the rug, and made a decision I had only understood later. "You could have left," he said with a low voice, "when I opened the office door. You already had what we needed. You could have left before." "I could have," I agreed, "but you stayed." "I stayed." He looked at me for a second with that total and quiet attention, and then raised his hand and brushed a strand of hair from my face with his fingers, slowly, with the kind of care that isn't a lover's gesture, but someone who's deciding something while doing it. And when his hand settled on my face this time, there was no strategy behind it, no dinner to impress, no audience, just the hallway and the dark window and the pieces of torn contract that neither of us was holding anymore. "The agreement is over," he said, with an even lower voice. "It's over," I confirmed. "So what comes next?" he said, and there was a real question there, without assumption, the kind that only appears when someone who controls everything decides to give up control of one specific thing and let it be answered by someone else. I stood looking at him for a second, at the face I had learned to read in layers, at the eyes that had found me before I walked into that club and that, for reasons that had started calculated and ended somewhere else entirely, had never looked in another direction when I was in the room. "Whatever comes," I said, but without a contract. The corner of his mouth moved, and this time I let mine move too. Outside, the Ferrante's party continued with its lights and music, and Rafael Conte was probably making some dry comment to no one in particular, and Christmas was happening with the beautiful indifference that Christmases have, and none of those things mattered as much as the door at the end of the hallway that closed from the inside a few minutes later, and the silence that came after it. Chapter 9. What the contract didn't account for. 2 months after Christmas at the estate, the apartment that had been Mateo's had become ours without anyone signing anything. My things had migrated in waves. First a toothbrush, then a coat forgotten on purpose, then a drawer, then 3 shelves and one side of the closet he had emptied without comment, like someone moving furniture to make space for something that should have already been there. What had come after that night at the estate hadn't been simple, and I didn't expect it to be, and Mateo hadn't promised it would be. There were days when he closed up completely for reasons I was still learning not to take personally, and days when I got so inside my own head that he needed to ask me the same thing twice before I heard. There were arguments that started about one thing and arrived, after 20 minutes, at a deeper layer, and that ended with one of us yielding not from weakness but from choice, which is a difference I had taken time to learn to recognize. But there was also the morning coffee he knew how to make right, without me needing to ask. The way he read in the same room as me without needing it to become conversation. The hand that sometimes landed on my back when I stood looking at something, not possessive, just present. Like someone saying I'm here without turning it into a declaration. One February night, lying in the dark, I asked the ceiling and him at the same time, "Do you regret how it started?" His hand was on my back, making a slow movement I didn't know if he realized he was making. "No," he said, with a low voice. "But if I could choose again, I'd start differently." "How?" "I would have told you the truth at the club." I sat with that for a moment. The image of Mateo Romano standing in that bar telling me who he really was, what he wanted, why he was there. I would have left, would have canceled everything, called Isla in a panic, spent the night rationalizing why it was better that way. I wouldn't have stayed, I admitted. "I know." The hand continued its movement. "That's why I didn't." And there, in that darkness, I understood there was a difference between forgiving and accepting, and that I had done both without realizing it, at different moments, and that acceptance had come first, in the mornings of coffee, and the silences on the sofa, and forgiveness had come later, slowly, not as a decision, but as a realization that the anger had left without warning, and in its place something more durable had remained. I had built something real, and real had texture, had weight, had both sides, and still it was the most whole thing I'd ever had. The documents from Augusto's safe remained stored in a place Raphael had chosen, and that I didn't know, by mutual decision, and for security. Mateo had said his team was analyzing everything, and that it would take time, and I had accepted this with the patience of someone who trusts the process without needing to control every step, a patience I didn't possess naturally, and that I had learned in the last 2 months out of pure necessity. I didn't think much about the documents, not because they didn't matter to me, but because life had become full of more immediate and warmer things: the apartment, the man beside me, the strange and good feeling of waking up without needing to put on armor before getting out of bed. That night, with the city making its noises outside and Mateo falling asleep beside me with the breathing I had already memorized without meaning to, I thought about the night I had walked into a club with a contract in my pocket and the most naive and bravest plan of my adult life. I had hired a man to pretend he admired me, to appear at my side in a family war, and come out the other side with the illusion of someone who had turned things around. The plan had worked beyond anything I had imagined, for reasons that weren't in the contract, through a man who had arrived calculating every step and who had stopped calculating at some point neither of us could name. I closed my eyes with his hand still on my back and the apartment in silence, and let myself sleep with the dangerous tranquility of someone who believes the worst has passed. Almost asleep, I heard Mateo's phone vibrate on the nightstand, once, twice, 3 times. Rafael's name lighting up the screen in the dark. Mateo didn't move. He was sleeping, or pretending to be, and I didn't open my eyes to check. Rafael could wait until morning. Everything could wait until morning. I turned to the other side and sank into the pillow, and the last thing I registered before falling asleep was the phone stopping vibrating and the silence returning to its place, intact and perfect and completely false. End of part 1. I spent 23 years believing one version about my mother, why I grew up the way I did, why I was never enough to make anyone stay. It was a clean, closed version that I had swallowed at 7 and never questioned again. Then I found a folder that demolished everything I believed about my own life in 3 pages. What was written there changed everything: who I was, where I came from, and who had destroyed my family from the inside. But the worst part wasn't what the document said. The worst part was Mateo, looking at me with the expression of someone who already knew and had chosen silence. Lena here. That wraps up book 1, and I've already finished book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. I spent 23 years believing one version about my mother, why I grew up the way I did, why I was never enough to make anyone stay. It was a clean, closed version that I had swallowed at 7 and never questioned again. Then I found a folder that demolished everything I believed about my own life in 3 pages. What was written there changed everything: who I was, where I came from, and who had destroyed my family from the inside. But the worst part wasn't what the document said. The worst part was Mateo, looking at me with the expression of someone who already knew and had chosen silence. As you can see, that was just a little taste of book 2. To watch the full uncensored version, just click the first link in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in just a few seconds. Just a reminder, click that first link down in the comments, and the complete book 2, ad-free and uninterrupted, will be waiting for you. It's that simple. I'm absolutely loving working on book 2, and since you guys are loving it too, I promise there's more to come. This is where you'll find stories that get even steamier, true dark romance. And because this version is getting so much more spicy, the video wouldn't be well received publicly on YouTube. This private space is where I can really show my true essence, and where I feel free to do my best work for you all. Keep in mind that the channel has been demonetized. So this is a way for me to keep my team together and continue bringing high-quality stories to you. I'll have even more updates for you soon. I'll be waiting for you at that first link in the pinned comment. Unfortunately, many people have been downloading our audio, effectively copying the entire story, and simply reposting it on YouTube. If you want to watch the original story and be the first to receive the next ones, search for My Stories by Lena on YouTube to get the best dark romance content. Remember, the official channel is My Stories by Lena on YouTube. I'll be waiting for you there.